It all starts in a quiet pharmacy. Just another ordinary night or so, it seems. A hardworking black woman walks in, tired from a long shift, just trying to pick up her prescription. But when a simple mistake spirals into suspicion, and two corrupt cops show up, ready to make an example out of her, things take a dark, ugly turn. They think they can humiliate her, frame her, and erase her dignity without a second thought. What they don't know is that she's not alone, and the storm she's about to unleash will tear through everything they thought they controlled. Stay with us because the twists coming are bigger than anyone could imagine. Tell us where you're tuning in from. We'd love to hear your story, too. It was supposed to be just another ordinary night. Gloria Tate, a 58-year-old nurse who had spent the past 30 years patching up broken bodies and soothing aching souls, was finally clocking out after a brutal double shift. Her feet were killing her. Her back was stiff from hours of nonstop rounds. But all she could think about was getting her prescription refill before heading home. The heat still clung to the Georgia air, thick and sticky. Even though the sun had set hours ago, the kind of night where even the breeze felt tired. The local pharmacy sat on the corner of a quiet suburban strip mall. Mostly dark now, except for the sickly yellow glow bleeding out of its windows. Gloria parked her old sedan in a spot under the one flickering streetlight, grabbed her purse, and headed inside. She moved with that tired, careful grace that nurses seem to carry naturally. A quiet dignity even when their bodies were screaming for rest. Inside the place was almost empty. A teenage clerk yawned behind the counter, tapping aimlessly on his phone. Gloria gave him a polite smile and handed over her ID, insurance card, and the little paper slip her doctor had written for her blood pressure meds. Simple routine. She had picked up prescriptions here for years. The kid looked bored as he scanned the documents, barely glancing at her before clacking away on the register. Minutes stretched longer than they should have. Gloria shifted from foot to foot, noticing the kid frown at the computer screen, squinting. Then he whispered something to the store manager. A tight-faced white woman in her 40s with a pinched expression like she'd smelled something rotten. The woman glanced at Gloria. Then again, her lips tightened. She tapped something on the computer screen herself, speaking to the clerk in hushed tones Gloria couldn't make out. The air shifted subtly but unmistakably. Gloria felt it immediately, the heavy, invisible weight pressing down on her shoulders. She knew this feeling. Every black person knew this feeling when suspicion slithered into the room before a single word was spoken. Finally, the manager approached the counter, her smile brittle and her voice saccharine. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but there's an issue with your prescription." Gloria frowned, confused, but calm. "Issue? I've picked up this same medication here for years." The manager's hands were fidgety. "The account details, they don't match. I'm afraid we can't process this tonight." Gloria leaned in slightly. "That's not possible. You have my ID, my insurance card. Everything matches. Check again." But the woman was already stiffening. Stepping back. "I'm going to have to ask you to wait here. Ma'am, we've contacted the authorities to investigate." For a second, Gloria thought she must have misheard. "Authorities," she echoed. Her voice was quiet, dangerously level. The boy behind the counter looked like he wanted to melt into the floor. He wouldn't meet her eyes. The manager's chin lifted in that way. People do when they know they've already decided you're guilty. Gloria took a slow breath. Years in emergency rooms had taught her how to stay calm when the walls started closing in. But this was something colder, something older than just bad customer service. This was the ugly familiar stink of being judged guilty by the color of your skin before you even opened your mouth. Outside, the faint wail of sirens floated through the warm night air. Gloria stood her ground. She could have left. She could have demanded her paperwork back and walked out, but that would have looked like guilt. And she had done nothing wrong. No, this time she would stand and wait. Minutes later, the door chimed sharply as two police officers stepped inside. Both white, both wearing that look of casual authority that said they expected the world to move aside when they entered a room. The first officer was tall, broad-chested, with a short cropped buzz cut and a slight sneer curling his lip. The second was younger, thinner, hanging back slightly like he wasn't sure if he was supposed to enjoy this or not. Gloria caught the quick lazy glance. They gave her the kind of look that wasn't curiosity, but assumption. The manager rushed forward, her voice dropping into an urgent fake humble tone. "That's her," she hissed. She tried to pick up medication fraudulently. "The accounts don't match. I think she might be using someone else's insurance." The first officer didn't even glance at the computer. Didn't ask for any paperwork. He squared his shoulders, stepping toward Gloria like a lion, circling wounded prey. "Ma'am," he said, voice dripping condescension. I'm going to need you to step outside. Gloria stood tall. I haven't done anything wrong. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. The manager folded her arms, watching with a glint of satisfaction. The first officer's hand moved to his belt. We can do this the easy way or the hard way. The threat was barely hidden. Other customers in the pharmacy were starting to stare. A mother grabbed her child's hand and hurried away. A man near the cold medicine aisle pulled out his phone and started recording. Gloria caught the subtle movement out of the corner of her eye. Good. Let them record. Still, she felt that old familiar heat rising in her chest, the tight knot of rage and humiliation tangled together. After everything she had done in her life, helping save lives, comforting the dying, working double shifts through pandemics, this was how she was treated. Like a criminal, like a danger. Because of the color of her skin, Gloria forced herself to breathe deeply slowly. Her heart was hammering, but her face remained a mask of calm. I have my ID. I have my insurance. I have proof that this prescription is mine, she said evenly, holding the documents up. The officer barely glanced at them. Step outside. When she didn't move immediately, he stepped forward, grabbing her wrist roughly. Gasps rippled through the pharmacy. Gloria didn't fight. Fighting would give them the excuse they wanted. Instead, she allowed herself to be led out, head held high. As the metal of the handcuffs bit cold and sharp into her skin, she heard the murmurs. She felt the dozens of eyes on her. She saw, even through the growing blur of emotion, the little victorious smirk on the manager's face, but she didn't look away. Not from the manager. Not from the officers. As they shoved her into the back of the squad car, Gloria met the officer's eyes and said in a voice steady as steel, "You're making the biggest mistake of your life." The door slammed shut, sealing her in. And somewhere deep inside her chest, past the hurt and the humiliation, a small cold flame began to burn because they had no idea who they were messing with. Not yet. But they would. And when the reckoning came, it would be swift. It would be brutal, and it would leave a mark they'd never forget. The ride to the station was quiet, but it wasn't the kind of quiet that lets you breathe easy. It was the kind that presses on your chest, makes the air feel heavier with every mile. Gloria sat stiffly in the back seat, the handcuffs cutting into her wrists, the cool metal digging against bone. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She knew that in their minds, silence could be twisted into guilt, but no explanation she gave would change what they had already decided about her. The officers in the front, Officer Rick Coleman driving, Officer David Miller riding shotgun, talked to each other in low, casual voices like she wasn't even there, like she was just a package they had picked up. A problem to be filed away before grabbing a late-night coffee. Coleman chuckled at something Miller said, shaking his head. Another fraud case. What is it with these people thinking they can just walk in and take whatever they want? His voice was low, but Gloria heard every word. Miller mumbled something back, less distinct, less certain, but he didn't disagree. Gloria stared out the window, the lights of Savannah blurring past, her jaw locked tight. Every muscle in her body wanted to scream, to fight back, to demand that they see her. When they pulled into the small rundown precinct, she had seen Coleman yank the door open, didn't make it out of her out with an impatient flick of his hand. Let's go. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. She climbed out carefully, feeling every pair of eyes in the parking lot burn into her. Other officers stood around, sipping coffee, chatting, pretending not to notice, but they noticed Gloria could feel their curiosity like a weight on her back. Inside the station was no better. The walls were painted a sickly off-white. The floor scuffed and stained. The smell of cheap disinfectant and stale coffee filled the air. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh, unflattering glare on everything. They led her to the booking desk. Miller fumbled with the cuffs while Coleman filled out a form, scribbling lazily. Name, Gloria Tate, age 58. Race, black. That last box, Gloria thought bitterly, was the only one they had cared about tonight. Coleman smirked as he pushed the form toward the desk sergeant. Suspected prescription fraud, he said loud enough for everyone within 20 feet to hear. Caught red-handed at the pharmacy. The desk sergeant, a balding man with heavy jowls, gave Gloria a glance, then shrugged. Another black woman. Another statistic. Another night. They took her mug shot. Flash. A bright, blinding light. A click that sounded like a door slamming shut. Then they fingerprinted her, pressing her sore wrist roughly against the ink pad, rolling each finger mechanically, like she was already guilty, like there was no point pretending otherwise. Afterward, they walked her toward the holding cells. Gloria's shoes squeaked against the linoleum, each step slow and deliberate. As they passed through the station, she caught snippets of conversation. What's she in for? Fraud, I think. Figures. Every comment stung, not because she believed them, but because she knew how easily lies once spoken could grow roots and become truths in the minds of people who didn't want to know better. They shoved her into a cell, bare, cold metal bench bolted to the wall, and slammed the door shut with a clang that echoed down the hallway. Coleman leaned against the bars, smirking. You want to tell us the real story now? He asked, his voice mocking. Might go easier for you if you come clean. Gloria met his gaze, unflinching. The real story is you're going to regret tonight. Miller snorted from where he leaned against the opposite wall. Yeah, sure. You got a magic lawyer hiding in your purse or something. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. Coleman shrugged. Suit yourself. You can sit here and think about it. They walked away, their heavy boots thudding against the floor, leaving her alone with the humming fluorescent lights and the smell of bleach and defeat. Gloria sat still for a long moment, her hands resting carefully in her lap, her breathing slow and measured. Then she turned her wrists, studying the red welts the cuffs had left behind. Evidence, not just of what they had done tonight, but of what they had always been willing to do, if they thought no one would call them out. She shifted slightly, feeling the hard metal bench under her, the chill of the concrete walls. She was tired, bone-tired. But somewhere underneath the exhaustion, under the bruises and the humiliation, that small flame from earlier still burned, steady, fierce. The injustice of it all could have broken someone else. But not Gloria Tate. She had faced worse. She had survived worse. And she wasn't alone. The clock above the booking desk ticked loudly. 9:42 p.m. It wouldn't be long now. She knew Walter was already moving. Her father wasn't a man who wasted time. If anything, the injustice tonight would only make him move faster, make him more dangerous. Out in the hallway, voices rose. First low, then louder, then the sharp, unmistakable crack of a desk being slapped. Coleman's voice carried down the corridor. What do you mean? Somebody's calling from D.C. at this hour. A pause then. Yeah, well, tell them they can shove it. Gloria smiled slightly to herself. She recognized that tone, the bravado of a man who knew he had stepped into quicksand, but still thought he could walk his way out of it. The phone rang again, louder this time, longer. Another officer picked it up, and his voice went tight immediately. Yes, sir, she's here. Yes, sir. Right away, Gloria leaned back against the cold concrete wall and closed her eyes for a brief moment. It had begun. They thought they were dealing with another tired black woman, too exhausted to fight back. But what they had actually done was light a match over a pool of gasoline. And now the fire was coming for them. Not in days, not in weeks. Tonight. She opened her eyes and waited because justice wasn't just a dream for someone like Gloria Tate. It was a storm, and it was almost here. The minutes dragged like hours inside that holding cell. Gloria sat upright on the cold metal bench, her hands resting carefully in her lap. She refused to slouch. She refused to show anything that looked like defeat. If they wanted to humiliate her, they were going to have to work a lot harder than this. Footsteps echoed down the hallway every few minutes. Sometimes heavy boots stomping with purpose. Sometimes the lazy shuffle of someone killing time. None of them stopped at her door. None of them even glanced her way. They didn't need to. In their minds, she was already categorized and forgotten. Another case number. Another woman who didn't matter. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed and flickered, throwing brief, jerky shadows across the gray walls. Somewhere down the hall, a phone rang again, sharp and urgent, but it was quickly answered and cut off. The tension in the building had shifted. Gloria could feel it like a change in air pressure before a storm. Officer Coleman swaggered back down the hallway, pretending he wasn't rattled. His smirk was still there, but thinner now, like a cracked mask, barely holding together. He stopped outside her cell, tapping the metal bars with his knuckles like he was knocking on a door. How you holding up in there, Grandma? He drawled. Gloria tilted her head slightly, studying him. He wanted a reaction. He needed it. She stayed silent. Coleman shrugged, pretending it didn't bother him. You know, we could have cut you loose with just a warning, but now you're looking at real charges, attempted fraud, maybe even resisting arrest if we want to get creative. He grinned wider, but his eyes darted toward the front desk where officers were whispering more urgently than before. Gloria allowed herself a small, slow smile. You don't even realize it yet, do you? She said quietly. Coleman's grin faltered just a hair. Realize what? She leaned forward, her voice low and steady, that the walls are already closing in. Before he could answer, The door to the front of the station banged open hard enough that even from the holding cells, Gloria could hear it. A different kind of silence swept through the building. The kind that wasn't about boredom or routine anymore. This was a silence full of held breath and darting glances. Gloria stayed perfectly still. She didn't need to see him to know who had just walked in. Walter Tate, her father, the retired FBI legend whose name still made certain people in law enforcement sit a little straighter. Speak a little more carefully. The man who had spent decades pulling corrupt officers out of their safe little corners and shining a blinding light straight into their darkness. And now he was here. For her. She heard low voices at the front desk. Not angry, worse, calm, controlled. A few, yes, sir, murmured hurriedly. A few officers scattering like leaves in the wind. Footsteps slow, deliberate, moved toward the back of the station. Officer Miller appeared first, peeking around the corner toward the holding cells. His face was pale, his mouth drawn into a thin, nervous line. He whispered something to Coleman, urgent, panicked. Coleman snapped at him under his breath. But Gloria could see it now, the crack spreading through the bravado. The realization beginning to dawn, he knew something was wrong. He just didn't know how bad it was going to get yet. Two men in dark suits and earpieces followed Miller down the hall. Gloria recognized them instantly. Federal agents, not local cops, not rent cops, the real deal. Behind them walked Walter Tate. He hadn't changed much since he retired. Maybe a few more lines on his face, a little more silver in his closely cropped hair, but his back was still straight, his eyes still sharp, and his presence still filled a room the way a storm fills the sky. Slow, inevitable, and impossible to ignore. He didn't look at the officers. He looked straight at Gloria. And when their eyes met, 1,000 unspoken words passed between them. I'm here. You're not alone. Not this time. Walter turned his gaze to Coleman. Then the effect was immediate. The way the manager had looked at her like she didn't belong. The way Coleman had grabbed her, sneered at her, treated her like she was disposable. And now the world saw it, too. Now the world cared. Another agent approached, dropping a thick file on the table in front of Ramirez. Financials, he said shortly. We followed the money trail. Civil asset forfeit abuses, off-the-books bonuses for officers with the highest street stops. Gloria's stomach twisted tighter. They weren't just bullies. They were predators built into the system, rewarded for it. Ramirez flipped through the documents quickly, then set them down with a grim finality. This, she said, is systemic corruption. Walter didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just nodded because he already knew. He had always known. It was why he had fought so hard, even long after retirement. It was why he hadn't hesitated when Gloria called him. Because this wasn't just a bad department. It was a disease, and it was time to cut it out. The agents continued filing evidence, preparing the formal charges. Plans were being made to expand the investigation. Other precincts, other cases, other cities. This was just the beginning. Gloria stood up slowly, her body still stiff from the long night. Walter turned to her, something almost like a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. You ready for the next part? He asked. Gloria met his gaze. Steady and sure. I was born ready, she said. And she meant it. The news broke faster than anyone could control. By the time Gloria and Walter walked into the press conference that afternoon, the room was already packed wall to wall. Reporters crammed into every available inch of space. Cameras stacked 3 deep. Microphones pointed like weapons toward the podium at the front. The mayor of Savannah stood behind it, pale and stiff like a man attending his own funeral. Beside him, the interim police chief, a woman who looked like she hadn't slept in days, clutched a thick file of prepared statements and talking points that by now felt useless. Walter and Gloria took their seats quietly near the front, surrounded by federal agents and DOJ officials who flanked them like sentinels. The mayor cleared his throat into the microphone, the sound sharp and jarring in the heavy silence. Today, he began, his voice shaky. We are announcing sweeping changes in response to the findings uncovered by the Department of Justice's investigation. He paused, glancing sideways at the federal agents like he needed their permission to continue. We acknowledge, he said, choosing his words carefully, that systemic issues within our police department have led to violations of civil rights, abuses of authority, and a failure to protect the very citizens we are sworn to serve. Cameras flashed wildly. Reporters murmured, pens flying across notepads. Gloria sat still, every muscle in her body tight. She didn't trust it yet. Words were cheap. Promises cheaper. She needed to see action. And she wasn't the only one. The mayor swallowed hard before continuing. Effective immediately, Officers Rick Coleman and David Miller have been terminated from the Savannah Police Department. A roar rose from the crowd outside. Cheers, applause, the release of anger that had been building all night. The mayor waited, letting it wash over him. He continued. Furthermore, criminal charges are being filed against both individuals, including obstruction of justice, falsifying police reports, unlawful arrest, and civil rights violations under federal law. Another round of camera flashes lit the room, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. Gloria could feel it in her bones. The mayor flipped a page of his notes, his hand trembling slightly. We are also beginning the process of a full independent review of all past complaints filed against the department over the last 10 years. A federal monitor will be assigned to oversee all activities moving forward. He took a deep breath, clearly reaching the part of the statement he dreaded the most. And we offer our public apology to Miss Gloria Tate. All eyes turned to her. The mayor's voice dropped thick with something that sounded rehearsed. We recognize that Ms. Tate was wrongfully detained, humiliated, and mistreated. Her dignity was stripped away by individuals who abused their power. For that, we are deeply sorry. The words hung there, thin and brittle, as if even he knew how little they really weighed against what had been done. Gloria didn't move. She didn't blink. She just let the silence stretch, refusing to make it easy for them. Walter sat beside her, his posture relaxed but alert, watching, waiting. The interim police chief stepped forward then, adding her own piece to the growing pile of apologies. We are committed to rebuilding the trust we have broken, she said, her voice stronger than the mayor's. We will implement mandatory racial bias training, overhaul our internal review processes, and open channels for community oversight. More promises, more plans. Gloria listened carefully, filing every word away because promises were easy to make when the cameras were rolling. The real test would come when the lights faded and the world moved on. The questions started flying then, reporters shouting over each other, microphones thrust forward. When did the department first know about the complaints against officers Coleman and Miller? How deep does the corruption go? Will higher-ups be held accountable? Tate. Ms. Tate. How do you feel right now? Gloria stood slowly. The room quieted almost immediately, every eye snapping to her. She didn't walk to the podium. She didn't need to. She just stood there, her voice calm and steady as she spoke. I didn't survive what happened to me last night, just so I could hear empty apologies. She said, I'm here because people like me have been ignored, dismissed, and destroyed for far too long. A ripple moved through the reporters. Gloria continued, her voice gaining strength. I am not special. I'm not unique. I'm just the one who had someone powerful enough to answer my call. But there are hundreds, thousands of others who don't, who never get their names in the paper, who never get justice. Her gaze swept the room, sharp and unwavering. I accept your apology, she said, her voice like steel wrapped in silk. But I will not accept anything less than real lasting change. Cheers erupted outside the building, the sound so loud it rattled the windows. Gloria turned without another word and walked out, leaving the politicians and officials scrambling behind her. The crowd outside parted like a wave as she stepped into the sunlight. Reporters shouted questions. Protesters cheered her name. Strangers reached out just to touch her shoulder, as if her strength might somehow rub off on them. Walter followed at her side, silent, proud. At the edge of the crowd, Gloria stopped and turned, taking it all in: the people, the cameras, the raw electric feeling hanging in the air. It was bigger than her now, bigger than anything she had imagined when she'd sat in that cold cell, hands cuffed and head pounding. This was a movement, and it was just getting started. Walter leaned in, his voice low enough only she could hear. You changed something today, he said. Gloria smiled. A small, tired smile full of sadness and hope all at once. Maybe, she said. But not enough. Walter chuckled softly. It's a start, and it was a messy, imperfect start. But for the first time in a long time, it felt like the world might actually be tilting a little closer toward justice. And Gloria Tate, nurse, survivor, fighter, was right at the center of it, exactly where she was meant to be. The weeks that followed moved fast, too fast. Really, for a city that was used to sweeping its problems under the rug. At first it started quietly. A few community leaders meeting in small rooms. A few civil rights lawyers exchanging long, serious phone calls. A few emails passed between people who normally didn't trust each other, but suddenly realized they had the same bruises, the same anger smoldering inside. Then it started to grow. One former victim came forward, then another and another. Men, women, teenagers, senior citizens. All of them had stories, some old, some recent, all cut from the same cloth of humiliation, brutality, and silence. Gloria attended the first meeting almost by accident. Walter had gotten a call from an old colleague, a civil rights attorney named Marcus Dean, asking if they would come listen. Not to speak, just to listen. And so they did. They sat in the back of a rented church hall, the metal chairs cold and uncomfortable, and listened as person after person stood up and told their story. A young black man wrongfully arrested for matching a description while jogging. A Latina mother forced out of her car at gunpoint during a broken taillight stop. An elderly man beaten during a late-night welfare check that turned violent without cause. The stories poured out raw and unfiltered, and Gloria felt something settle deep in her chest, a heavy, aching kind of fury that had nothing to do with her own experience and everything to do with the system that had allowed all of this to happen. Walter sat next to her, stone-faced, arms folded tight across his chest. But she could see the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers tapped a silent rhythm against his bicep. He was taking it all in. Every word, every injustice. When Marcus Dean finally stood up at the front of the room fell quiet. He didn't yell. He didn't shout. He just spoke plainly. "We have an opportunity here," he said. "We have evidence. We have witnesses. And most importantly, we have momentum." He paused, letting that sink in. "We can file a class action lawsuit against the city, the police department, and every officer implicated. We can drag every ugly truth into the light where it belongs." The room buzzed with low, anxious murmurs. Some people looked scared, some skeptical. A few nodded, eyes burning with resolve. Marcus's gaze found Gloria where she sat at the back. "But we can't do it without someone willing to stand at the front," he said. "Someone the public already knows, someone they believe in." Gloria felt every head in the room turn toward her. The weight of it hit hard, sudden and undeniable. For a moment, she wanted to shrink away, to let someone else carry the load this time. But then she thought about that metal bench in the holding cell, about the cuffs cutting into her wrists, about the cold look in Officer Coleman's eyes, about the trembling hands of the teenager pinned against the car. The silent sobs of the woman shoved into the back seat, the haunted faces filling this room. She stood up slowly. The room went dead silent. "I'll do it," she said, her voice steady. And that was it. The lawsuit moved faster than anyone expected. Within a month, the legal team filed official paperwork, dozens of plaintiffs listed, hundreds of pages of documented abuses, and a clear demand, accountability, reparations, and federal oversight. The city tried to fight back at first. They hired expensive lawyers. They issued carefully worded statements denying systemic problems. They threw around words like isolated incidents and miscommunications, but it was too late. The evidence was overwhelming. The public pressure was relentless, and the national media attention made it impossible to sweep anything under the rug. One by one, cracks appeared in the city's defenses. First came the resignation of the police chief quietly in the dead of night with no press conference, no farewell parade. Then came the suspension of half a dozen senior officers tied to the buried complaints. And finally, inevitably, the mayor himself announced he wouldn't seek re-election, citing health reasons no one believed for a second. But it didn't stop there. Walter and Gloria watched as other cities started reaching out community organizers, civil rights groups, even whistleblowers inside other departments. They wanted advice. They wanted help. They wanted to know how Savannah had done it. Because what had started as one arrest, one injustice had become a blueprint, a roadmap for dismantling corruption from the inside out. One evening, Gloria sat with Walter on the back porch of her modest little house, the crickets chirping in the warm Georgia air. The sky was painted deep purple and gold, the last scraps of sunlight fading over the horizon. She sipped her sweet tea slowly, letting the quiet settle over them. "You ever think we'd see something like this?" she asked. Walter chuckled low in his throat. "Not in my lifetime," he admitted. "Hell, not even in my dreams some days." They sat for a while longer, watching the stars come out one by one. Finally, Gloria spoke again. "It's not over, is it?" Walter shook his head slowly. "No," he said, "it never is. There will always be another fight, another battle." He looked at her then, his eyes fierce and proud. "But you made them see. You made them care." Gloria smiled. A real one this time. Tired, yes, but full of something deeper, something stronger. Hope. Not the blind, naive kind. The hard-earned kind that only grows after you've fought through the worst of it and come out the other side. Still standing inside the house. Her phone buzzed with another message. Another reporter wanting an interview. Another civil rights leader wanting her to speak at a rally. Gloria let it buzz for tonight. She just wanted to sit here under the stars with her father at her side. She would pick up the fight again tomorrow because now she understood something she hadn't known before. The real power wasn't in one lawsuit. It wasn't even in bringing down corrupt officers or exposing a broken system. The real power was in refusing to be silent and standing up and being seen. And no matter how many battles lay ahead, Gloria Tate was ready. Because once you start telling the truth, you don't go back. 6 months later, Savannah was a different city. The protests had faded into memory, but the changes they forced remained. New leadership at the police department, new policies, new faces walking the halls where old ghosts used to linger. And for the first time in a very long time, people in the community started to believe just a little that maybe things could be different. Maybe this time change would stick. Gloria stood at the back of the federal courthouse, watching the final moments of the trial unfold. The polished floors gleamed under the fluorescent lights. The air inside was thick with anticipation, the kind that made every breath feel heavier. At the defense table, Rick Coleman and David Miller sat stiffly, their suits wrinkled, their faces pale. Gone were the arrogant smirks, the swagger. They looked smaller somehow, diminished not by the process itself, but by the undeniable truth that had finally caught up to them. The jury filed back into the courtroom, their faces unreadable. Gloria watched without blinking as the foreman rose, holding the verdict slip in trembling hands on the charges of obstruction of justice. Guilty on the charges of falsifying police reports. Guilty on the charges of unlawful arrest and deprivation of civil rights. Guilty, guilty, guilty. The words echoed in the heavy silence, bouncing off the marble walls, settling like dust in the corners of the room. Coleman slumped forward, his head in his hands. Miller just stared straight ahead, his eyes hollow. Neither of them looked at Gloria. They didn't dare. The judge thanked the jury and adjourned the court. People began to stir, gathering their papers, whispering among themselves. But Gloria stayed rooted to the spot, letting it all wash over her. She didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel vengeful. What she felt mostly was tired, but it was a good kind of tired, the kind that came after a long, brutal fight, where you knew you had left everything on the field. Walter touched her elbow gently, bringing her back to the present. "You ready to go home?" he asked, his voice low and warm. Gloria nodded. They walked out of the courthouse together, past the reporters shouting questions, past the flashing cameras, past the curious onlookers craning their necks for a glimpse of the woman who had become a symbol of something bigger than herself. Outside the air was cool and sweet, touched with the first hints of spring. Elas bloomed along the sidewalks, their bright colors defiant against the backdrop of old brick buildings. Gloria took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the clean, heavy air. Freedom smelled different today. At the bottom of the courthouse steps, Marcus Dean was waiting for them. His briefcase slung over one shoulder, a broad smile on his face. "You did it," he said simply. Gloria shook her head. "We did it." Walter clapped Marcus on the back, and the three of them stood there for a moment, savoring it. Savoring the fact that for once the system had bent, had cracked, and even if it hadn't shattered completely, a crack was enough to start. Walter's phone buzzed with another call. Another community leader, another request for advice, for guidance. He silenced it with a swipe of his thumb and slipped it back into his pocket. Today wasn't about work. Today was about breathing. They decided to skip the press conferences and the interviews. Instead, they drove to Gloria's favorite little diner on the outskirts of town, a place with peeling vinyl booths and the best peach cobbler for a 100 miles. It wasn't glamorous, but it was home over greasy burgers and sweet tea. They talked about everything except the case. About Walter's stubborn tomato plants that refused to grow. About Marcus's daughter getting accepted to college. About Gloria's dream of finally taking that long postponed vacation. Somewhere she didn't have to be strong every second of the day. Somewhere she could just be. After lunch, Walter dropped Gloria off at her house. She stood on the porch for a long time after he drove away, staring out at the quiet street, the kids riding bikes, the old couple walking their dog, the world just going on for the first time in what felt like forever. She let herself believe she could have a life beyond survival. Inside, she kicked off her shoes, padded barefoot into the living room, and collapsed onto the couch with a sigh that came from the very depths of her being. Her phone buzzed again. She checked it, another request to speak at a rally, another interview offer. Gloria smiled faintly and set the phone face down on the coffee table. Not today. Today she wasn't a symbol. Today she wasn't a fighter. Today she was just Gloria. The woman who had been humiliated in a pharmacy, thrown into a cell, dragged through the mud, and had stood back up anyway. The woman who had refused to let them define her. The woman who had reminded a city and maybe a country that dignity isn't something anyone else can give you. It's something you carry inside. Even when the world tries to rip it away, she closed her eyes, listening to the hum of the ceiling fan, the distant laughter of kids playing down the street. She had won. Not because the system suddenly became perfect, not because the fight was over, but because she was still here, still standing, still fighting. And maybe, just maybe, inspiring others to do the same. The road ahead would still be hard. There would be more battles, more nights when the weight of it all would feel like too much. But Gloria Tate knew something now that could never be taken away. She was more than what they had done to her. She was more than their assumptions, their handcuffs, their small, mean imaginations. She was free, not because they said so, but because she said so. And that in the end was the only justice that truly mattered. When we look back at Gloria's story, it's easy to see it as a personal victory. But it's so much bigger than that. It's a reminder that injustice can live anywhere, sometimes hidden right under our noses, and that it takes courage, persistence, and the willingness to stand tall, even when everything feels stacked against you, to change it. This isn't just about one arrest. It's about every moment someone was treated like they didn't belong. Every time a voice was silenced. Every injustice that was swept under the rug because no one thought they could make a difference. Gloria's fight shows us that standing up matters no matter how hard it gets, no matter how long it takes. And it's a lesson we can all carry into our own lives. Whether it's speaking up for a neighbor, fighting for what's right in our communities, or teaching the next generation that dignity and respect are not negotiable. So, if this story moved you, if it stirred something deep inside, I hope you'll take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that shine a light on truth, resilience, and the kind of everyday courage that changes the world on a stand at a time. Because together, when we choose not to look away, when we stand up instead of standing by, we are stronger than we ever could be alone. Coleman straightened up like he was back in boot camp, his face flushing an angry, defensive red. Who's in charge here? Walter's voice was calm, deadly calm. The desk sergeant stumbled forward. That would be me, sir. Walter didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Good. Then you'll want to explain to me why a licensed nurse with valid identification and no criminal record is sitting in a holding cell tonight. The sergeant opened his mouth, closed it. Sweat beat at his temples. Walter continued, his voice even and merciless. You'll want to explain why your officers detained her without verifying this error, why they ignored clear evidence of her identity, why they physically restrained her in public without probable cause. He took a slow step closer, and you'll want to explain it very carefully, because as of 10 minutes ago, you're not just dealing with local fallout. You're dealing with a federal civil rights violation, and the Department of Justice is already on the line. Gloria watched as Coleman's face turned from red to almost gray. His jaw clenched so tight it looked painful. Walter glanced at the two agents beside him. Unlock the cell, he ordered. One agent produced a set of keys and moved to the door. Coleman finally found his voice. You can't just walk in here. And Walter turned his head slightly, fixing him with a look that could have frozen fire. I already have, he said. The cell door swung open with a soft metallic creak. Walter stepped forward and offered his hand to Gloria. She rose slowly, every movement measured, every muscle screaming for dignity. She didn't touch him right away. Instead, she stood on her own 2 feet, back straight, shoulders squared. Then she nodded once. Walter smiled just barely and stepped aside so she could walk out first. As she passed Coleman, she didn't even spare him a glance, but she saw the way his hands fisted at his sides, the way his throat bobbed when he swallowed hard. He knew. Finally, he knew this wasn't over. It was just beginning. And for the first time that night, Gloria allowed herself to exhale a slow, steady breath that tasted like victory, just starting to bloom. As Gloria stepped out of the cell, the entire station seemed to shift around her. Officers who had been standing casually moments ago suddenly found fascinating reasons to look anywhere but at her. The ones who had laughed, the ones who had whispered, all of them stiffened, their postures tight, their faces carefully blank. Walter walked just a step behind her, not crowding, not pushing, just there. A silent wall of authority at her back. The two federal agents flanked them, making it crystal clear that this was no polite request. This was a reckoning, walking through their halls, one deliberate step at a time. Gloria's wrist throbbed from the tightness of the cuffs. She ignored it. She ignored the looks, the half-finished sentences dying on people's lips as she passed. She carried herself like she had every right in the world to be there, which of course she did. That was the part they always hated the most. At the front desk, the sergeant shifted nervously behind the counter, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. Officer Miller hovered nearby, his shoulders hunched, looking like a man waiting for a verdict he already knew was coming. Walter didn't even glance at them. His attention was focused squarely on the desk phone, which had started ringing again, sharp, insistent, demanding. The sergeant hesitated, his hand hovering over the receiver like it might bite him. "Answer it," Walter said quietly. The sergeant picked it up with trembling fingers. "Savannah PD," he croaked. He listened for maybe 2 seconds before his face turned a sickly shade of gray. His head bobbed quickly in a series of frantic nods. "Yes, sir. Right away, sir." He held the phone out toward Walter, his hand shaking. It's for you." Walter took the receiver with the kind of calm you can't fake, his expression unchanged. He didn't bark into the phone. He didn't need to. "This is Tate," he said simply. There was a beat of silence. Then Walter smiled a small, cold smile that sent a ripple through the room. "Good," he said into the receiver. "Proceed." He hung up without another word and handed the phone back to the stunned sergeant like it was nothing more than a prop in a play he was directing. Gloria raised an eyebrow, her voice low enough only Walter could hear. "What did you just set in motion?" Walter didn't answer immediately. He turned to her, his face unreadable for a long moment. Then he leaned in just slightly, enough that no one else could hear. "You remember the civil rights unit I helped build before I retired?" he said. "They've been looking for a case to make an example out of. Looks like they just found it." Before Gloria could respond, the station door burst open again. This time, not with slow, deliberate steps, but with the hard, clattering rhythm of people moving with purpose. More federal agents, at least 6 of them, all moving quickly, efficiently, like they had trained for this moment 100 times before. They spread out through the station, some heading toward the offices, others pulling files, accessing computer terminals. One agent handed a thick folder to the desk sergeant, who took it like it might explode in his hands. "This station," the agent said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "is now under immediate federal audit pending civil rights violations." A gasp rippled through the officers. Coleman, standing off to the side, took a half-step forward, his face darkening. "You can't do that," he barked. "This is a local matter." Walter turned to face him, his voice still calm, almost amused. "You should read the fine print on your badge, officer," he said. "Local authority doesn't override federal law." Coleman opened his mouth to argue, but one of the agents stepped directly into his path, blocking him with a look that had no discussion. Gloria felt the weight of the room change again. This time, it wasn't heavy and depressive. This time it was electrified, charged with the realization dawning on every person there that the system they thought would always protect them had just flipped on its head. Walter motioned for Gloria to follow him toward the exit. They didn't rush. They didn't have to. Each step was a message. "We are not powerless. We are not invisible. And you will answer for what you've done." As they reached the door, Gloria paused for a brief moment. She turned back not to gloat, not to mock, but to let her gaze sweep across the faces staring at her, some guilty, some scared, some simply stunned that this night hadn't gone the way it always had before. She held their eyes, all of them. Then she turned back around and walked into the humid Georgia night. Free, the air outside felt different, cleaner, sharper. Walter fell into step beside her. For a while, neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. Finally, Gloria exhaled a slow breath. She hadn't realized she was holding. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet. Walter gave her a sideways glance, a rare softness touching his stern features. "You don't ever have to thank me for protecting you," he said. That's my job. That's always been my job. They walked to the car in silence. But before they reached it, Walter's phone buzzed again. He checked the screen and let out a small grunt of satisfaction. "What is it?" Gloria asked. Walter looked up, his eyes gleaming under the street lights. "Background checks," he said simply. "Turns out Coleman and Miller have quite a few skeletons rattling around. Excessive force complaints, racial profiling accusations, stuff the department buried." He slipped the phone back into his pocket. "Not anymore." Gloria shook her head, a humorless smile tugging at her lips. "They really thought they could just make me disappear." Walter's face hardened. "They thought you were alone." He opened the car door for her, and as she slid into the passenger seat, she realized how strange it felt to be sitting freely. No cuffs biting into her skin, no concrete walls pressing in around her. She was free, but the real fight was just beginning. Because Walter was right. They had thought she was alone, and now they were about to find out just how wrong they had been. Walter started the engine, and the car rumbled to life. As they pulled away from the curb, Gloria looked back one last time at the station behind them. The lights still burned inside. But the old rules, the ones that said people like her, had to just accept whatever was done to them. Those were flickering too. And tonight, maybe for the first time in a long time, something better was starting to rise from the ashes. She didn't know exactly what was coming next, but whatever it was, she was ready. Inside the station, the air had shifted into something heavier, something almost physical. It wrapped around the officers like a thick choking fog they couldn't quite shake off. No one said it out loud, but everyone felt it. That terrible creeping awareness that tonight had gone terribly wrong and there was no easy way out of it. The sergeant behind the desk kept pretending to shuffle papers, but his eyes kept darting to the door like he was expecting someone or something to storm through at any second. The younger officers, the ones who had watched Gloria's arrest like it was entertainment, now stood stiffly against the walls, their conversations cut short, their laughter dying in their throats. Coleman paced like a caged animal, his boots thudding against the scuffed floor. Every few minutes, he would glance toward the exit, then back toward the internal phones that hadn't stopped ringing since Walter Tate walked out with Gloria. His face was twisted into something between fury and fear, like he couldn't decide which one to wear more comfortably. Miller slumped against the far wall, chewed at his thumbnail until it bled, staring at the floor like maybe he could fall through it if he just wished hard enough. The clock on the wall ticked louder than seemed possible. Every second dragged. Every minute stretched so thin it felt like the room itself might snap under the weight. Another phone rang, then another. The sergeant picked one up, barked a few short words, then slammed it back down. He didn't look at anyone. No one asked what was said. They already knew it wasn't good. Out in the lobby, a small group of people had started to gather. Citizens, bystanders, people who had been at the pharmacy, people who had seen the videos starting to circulate online. Their faces were pressed against the glass doors, their eyes wide, their mouths moving as they talked to each other in urgent, animated whispers. They weren't carrying signs yet, but they would be. The storm was coming. Coleman stopped pacing, his jaw working furiously. This is getting blown way out of proportion. He snapped to no one in particular. She resisted. She made it complicated. No one responded. Even Miller didn't back him up. Deep down, they all knew the truth. Gloria hadn't resisted. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't fought. She had just stood there tired and dignified while they shoved her into cuffs and paraded her through a store full of people like she was a criminal. And now, every second that passed, the evidence of that injustice was multiplying, videos being shared, posts going viral, eyewitness statements being collected. The story wasn't contained to Savannah anymore. It was starting to bleed out across the state, across the country. Another federal agent entered the station. A woman with sharp eyes and a tighter jaw carrying a black tablet under her arm. She didn't wait to be invited in. She crossed the floor with quick clipped steps and spoke directly to the desk sergeant. "We need access to all body cam footage from tonight," she said, voice low but unarguable. "Every second, no edits, no gaps." The sergeant hesitated for a fraction too long. Her eyes narrowed. Now he fumbled for the login credentials, typing so fast he hit the wrong keys twice. Coleman watched, his fists clenching at his sides. "You can't just seize our footage without a warrant," he barked. The agent didn't even look at him. "You waived that right the second you initiated an arrest without probable cause. Congratulations." Across the room, another agent was already plugging a small device into the station's main server, pulling up files faster than anyone could stop him. Miller made a small choked noise deep in his throat, but stayed where he was, Pinned by the weight of his own cowardice, Coleman took a step forward, his voice rising. "You don't know what you're dealing with here." The female agent turned then, finally meeting his gaze. "Oh," she said softly. "We know exactly what we're dealing with." Her words hung there, sharp and cold. In the back, the murmuring among the officers grew louder, more frantic. Some were already texting, their thumbs flying over their phones, desperate for updates, desperate for instructions that weren't coming because the people who normally protected them, their captains, their unions, their good old boy networks, they were all going silent. They could feel it, too. The system wasn't circling the wagons this time. It was letting them hang. The internal phone started ringing again, more urgently now. No one rushed to answer. Someone in the squad room cursed under his breath. Another officer dropped his coffee cup, the crash echoing like a gunshot. No one picked it up. The female agent pulled up a screen on her tablet and began scrolling through body cam footage. The footage of Gloria at the pharmacy played in silent, damning clarity. Gloria handing over her ID. Gloria calmly explaining herself. Gloria not resisting, not fighting, not doing anything that warranted handcuffs. And Coleman sneering, mocking, manhandling. There it was, playing out frame by frame. No interpretation needed. No creative reports could fix this. The truth was right there for everyone to see. Coleman saw it, too. His chest rose and fell rapidly, his hands twitching like he didn't know whether to punch something or run. Miller just sat down heavily in the nearest chair, his face in his hands. The agent paused the video, tapping the screen. "This," she said simply, turning the tablet around to face the room. "This is what happens when you think no one's watching." No one spoke. No one moved. Gloria's voice echoed softly from the tablet, captured by the body cam microphone. Just one line, calm and steady, even in the face of all that cruelty. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life." The agent smiled thinly. Turns out, she said she was right. Out in the lobby, the crowd was growing. Now there were signs. Now there were chants. The press had started to arrive, too. Cameras flashing against the glass, microphones pressed against the door. The outside world was knocking. And for the first time in a very long time, the people inside the station realized they might not be able to keep it out. The sergeant sagged behind the desk, the fight draining out of him like air from a punctured tire. One by one, the officers of Savannah PD realized they weren't just facing a bad night. They were facing judgment. Real judgment, and it was only just getting started. The doors swung open again, and this time the atmosphere inside the station snapped so tight you could almost hear it crack. Walter Tate walked in like he owned the building, and in a way tonight he did. He didn't come alone. Flanking him were two high-ranking Department of Justice officials, their badges flashing under the fluorescent lights, their faces carved from stone. Behind them, another pair of federal agents carried heavy black cases, the kind that meant nothing good for whoever they were here to visit. Every officer in the room froze. Some stood up instinctively, old habits kicking in like soldiers at attention when a general enters the room. Others just stared wide-eyed like they were witnessing something they couldn't quite process yet. Walter didn't say a word at first. He just let the moment stretch out. Let them all feel it. The shift in power, the ground moving under their feet. He moved to the center of the room, his steps unhurried, his presence filling the space with a calm, lethal energy. The desk sergeant tried to stammer something, some half-formed protest. But Walter silenced him with just a look, a quiet, devastating look that said, "You had your chance. Now it's my turn." Officer Coleman stood near the back of the room, arms crossed tightly over his chest, chin jutted out in stubborn defiance. But even he couldn't quite hide the way his eyes kept darting to the federal badges, to the serious faces of the agents spreading out through the station. Walter finally spoke, his voice steady, low, but carrying effortlessly through the silence. "My name is Walter Tate," he said, though half the room already knew. "Retired Special Agent in Charge, FBI, current consultant for the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division." He let that sink in. "And as of 30 minutes ago," he continued, his tone razor-sharp, "this police station is under federal review for multiple violations of constitutional and civil rights." Miller let out a soft, strangled sound, a noise somewhere between a gasp and a whimper. Coleman shifted his weight from foot to foot, trying to look casual, failing miserably. Walter turned slowly, making eye contact with every officer in the room. No anger, no shouting, just a cold certainty that was somehow worse. "We're here to make sure justice isn't just a word painted on the wall," he said. One of the DOJ officials stepped forward, pulling out a stack of documents from his briefcase. Effective immediately, the official announced, Officers Rick Coleman and David Miller are suspended pending investigation into civil rights violations, wrongful arrest, and misconduct. The words hit like hammer blows. Coleman opened his mouth to protest, but Walter cut him off with a single raised hand. "Save it," Walter said. "You'll get your chance to talk." Under oath, the agent handed over 2 sealed envelopes to the desk sergeant, official notices of suspension. The sergeant took them with shaking hands. An agent approached Coleman and Miller, arms outstretched, badges and weapons. Now, for a second it looked like Coleman might refuse. His chest heaved, his fists clenched at his sides, his eyes burned with fury. But there was nowhere left to run. Slowly, reluctantly, he reached up and unpinned his badge. He slammed it down on the desk, so hard it rattled. Then he yanked his gun from its holster and set it down beside it with a harsh metallic clatter. Miller followed, moving like a man walking to his own execution. His badge came off with shaking fingers. His weapon set down almost gently, like maybe if he handled it carefully enough, he could still salvage something from this wreckage. Walter watched them with the same expressionless calm. "This is just the beginning," he said. "There will be depositions. There will be grand jury hearings, and when we're done, if the evidence supports it—" He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle like a stone on everyone's chest. "There will be federal charges." Someone at the back of the station let out a low curse. No one shushed him. No one spoke at all. Outside, the noise was growing louder. The crowd had doubled, maybe tripled. Reporters jostled for position. Camera flashes strobing against the dark glass. Protest signs bobbed up and down, a sea of anger and hope and demands for justice. Walter nodded toward the front door. "You should understand something," he said, his voice quiet but deadly. "This isn't going away when the cameras leave. This isn't a story that fades after a week." He looked directly at Coleman now, stripping him bare with his gaze. "You thought you could humiliate my daughter. You thought you could silence her. You thought you could shove her into a system designed to chew her up and spit her out." Walter took a step closer, his voice dropping even lower, more dangerous. "You didn't just attack my family," he said. "You attacked every single person who's ever been told they don't belong. Every person who's ever been treated like a criminal just for daring to exist." Coleman swallowed hard. His bravado was slipping, sliding off him like a cheap coat in a storm. "And now," Walter finished, "you're going to find out what it feels like to answer for it." The DOJ officials moved in, escorting Coleman and Miller away. Not in cuffs. Not yet, but with a quiet finality that said handcuffs weren't far behind. Walter watched them go without satisfaction, without triumph. This wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. When they were gone, the remaining officers stood frozen, not daring to breathe too loudly. Walter turned to the desk sergeant. "You'll cooperate fully with this investigation," he said. "You'll turn over every piece of footage, every incident report, every disciplinary file. No redactions, no disappearing paperwork." The sergeant nodded mutely. Walter gave him one last look, almost pitying. "You might want to call a lawyer," he said. "You're going to need one." Then he turned and walked out of the station, the federal agents falling into step behind him. Outside, the crowd erupted into cheers as Gloria appeared beside him, stepping into the flashing lights and the roar of vindication. Walter didn't raise a hand. He didn't smile for the cameras. He simply stood there tall and unmovable as the tide of justice surged around him. Tonight was only the beginning. But for the first time in a long time, it was a beginning built on truth. And there wasn't a single thing they could do to stop it. The sun had barely risen the next morning when the first headline hit. Local police station under federal investigation for civil rights abuse. By noon, it wasn't just local. CNN, MSNBC, even Fox News. Gloria's arrest video was everywhere. Her face splashed across television screens and social media feeds, captured mid-frame, tired, dignified, and defiant. And right beside her name, in every headline, in every news, Chiron, retired FBI agent's daughter, the story caught fire because it wasn't just about one woman anymore. It was about a system that had been rotten for too long. And this time, someone had finally forced the rod into the light. Inside the DOJ's Temporary Operations Center, a commandeered conference room just a few blocks away from the Savannah PD station, agents worked around the clock. They pored over files, pulled body cam footage, subpoenaed internal emails, cross-referenced incident reports that suddenly looked very different under fresh scrutiny. Gloria sat quietly in a corner of the room, watching it unfold. Walter was there, too, conferring quietly with the lead investigators. Every so often, he would glance over at Gloria just to check in, a silent, "Are you holding up? Okay." And she would give him the smallest nod. She was tired, bone-deep tired, but she wasn't backing down. The agents weren't just looking at her case. They were digging into years of complaints filed against officers Coleman and Miller. And not just them. The deeper they dug, the uglier it got. 15 excessive force complaints, 7 allegations of racial profiling, 3 internal affairs investigations. None of them properly closed, all swept under the rug, all buried by the same people who were supposed to hold them accountable. Emails surfaced. Messages between supervisors joking about shaking down troublemakers and keeping the streets clean the old-fashioned way. Texts between Coleman and Miller bragging about rough arrests. Screenshots of evidence tampering chain of custody violations. Even cases where body cam footage had mysteriously gone missing. But it wasn't missing now because somebody smarter or maybe just angrier had saved backup copies. And now every ugly damning second was being played out on 100 monitors viewed by agents who took notes with the cold detachment of people building a case they already knew would end careers. One clip in particular made Gloria's stomach twist. A black teenager, no more than 16, pinned face first against the hood of a patrol car, crying as Coleman barked insults at him. No crime, no justification, just rage and cruelty with a badge. Another clip. Miller laughing while shoving a Latina woman into the back of a squad car for talking back during a routine traffic stop. She hadn't been cited for anything. She had just asked why they pulled her over. Each video chipped away at whatever defense the department might have thought they could build. There would be no spinning this, no plausible deniability, no sweeping it away. Walter stood in the center of it all, arms folded across his chest, his jaw tight. He didn't look triumphant. He looked furious. Controlled fury, the kind that burns slow and lasts a lifetime. The lead DOJ agent, a woman named Special Agent Ramirez, finally turned to Gloria. Her voice was calm, but carried the weight of authority. "We have enough to recommend criminal charges," Ramirez said. "Not just misconduct, not just civil suits." She ticked them off on her fingers. Obstruction of justice, falsifying police reports, tampering with evidence. Deprivation of rights under color of law. She paused. "And that's just the beginning." Walter nodded once, grim and satisfied. "Good." Gloria said nothing. She just sat there absorbing it all. Because this wasn't just about her. It never had been. It was about the teenager pinned against the car. The woman shoved into the squad car. The countless others who hadn't been lucky enough to have a Walter Tate waiting in the wings. Outside the window, news vans lined the street. Protesters waved signs. Reporters shouted questions at anyone in uniform. The city was awake now, angry, watching. The phone on the conference table buzzed sharply. Agent Ramirez picked it up, listened for a moment, then covered the receiver with her hand, looking at Walter. "Internal Affairs has just placed the chief of police on administrative leave," she said. Walter raised an eyebrow. Voluntarily, Ramirez smirked. A rare